Hello everyone! We continue our series of retrospectives of iconic adventure game franchises with something out of this world. You can already find a similar full history video about Quest for Glory and a 2-hour documentary on the history of the genre with the rise and fall of the adventure games. If you like the content, please consider supporting my channel by subscribing and pressing this like button. Space Quest is a series of 6 comic science fiction adventure games released between 1986 and 1995. The games follow the adventures of space janitor named Roger Wilco as he campaigns through the galaxy for truth, justice, and really clean floors. According to Sierra Online, combined sales of the Space Quest series surpassed 1.2 million units. Initially created for Sierra Online by Mark Crow and Scott Murphy, who called themselves the two guys from Andromeda, the games parodied both science fiction properties such as Star Wars and Star Trek, even the theme song itself is a parody of the Star Wars theme, as well as pop culture phenomena. The series featured a silly sense of humor, heavily reliant on puns and wacky storylines. Roger Wilco, a perpetual loser, is often depicted as the underdog who repeatedly saves the universe, often by accident, only to be either ignored or punished for violating minor regulations in the process. Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, who had already worked together on the Sierra game The Black Cauldron, wanted to create a humorous science fiction adventure game. They also wanted it to star a janitor, a choice possibly inspired by the mop-wielding main character from Infocom's humorous sci-fi text adventure Planetfall. Murphy commented that Sierra was in a mindset where everything was medieval and it was all fairly serious. I wanted to do a game that was more fun. We even liked the idea of fun death. I mean, if the player is gonna die or fail, they should at least get a laugh out of it. Crow noted, "We wanted to do two things for the player. One, we wanted him to feel as if he was in a movie where he could just sort of kick back and enjoy the scenery. We also wanted the player to feel as if he really was the character on the screen." Although skeptical, Ken Williams gave the idea a shot. Scott and Mark created a short demo which ended up becoming the first forums of Space Quest 1, at which point Ken gave the project a green light. Space Quest Chapter 1 The Sarian Encounter, commonly known as Space Quest 1, is a graphic adventure game released on October of 1986 by Sierra Online. It is the first in the Space Quest series. Players of the original game are never told the hero's name, but are instead asked to enter their own. The default name of Roger Wilco, a reference to radio communication Roger will comply, became the standard of the hero in the latter games of the series. Roger is a janitor on board the scientific spaceship Arcada within the Ernon galaxy, which holds a powerful experimental device called the Star Generator, a thinly veiled reference to the Genesis device from Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. Roger emerges from an on-duty nap in a broom closet to find that the ship has been boarded and seized by the sinister Sarians. Using a keycard that he finds on the body of a dead crew member, he finds his way to an escape pod and escapes the Arcada. The game was created using Sierra's AGI engine and featured a pseudo 3D environment allowing the character to move in front of and behind background objects. The primary means of input in Space Quest was through the use of a text parser by entering commands and use of the keypad or arrow keys for moving Roger Wilco around the screen. The Amiga, Apple II, Atari ST and Mac versions of the game offered basic mouse support for movement as well. Sound cards were not available in 1986, so sound was played through the PC's internal speaker. Owners of Tandy 1000 or Amiga computers would hear a 3-voice soundtrack while Apple IIgs owners were treated to a 15-voice soundtrack with notably richer sound. Sierra released 3 versions of Space Quest: the original 1986 AGI release, the 1987 AGI V3 release, and the 1990 VGA release. Aside from minor sound and graphic differences, the PC, Amiga, Atari ST, and Apple IIgs versions are largely identical. The Mac version is considerably different, however, being monochrome and completely menu-driven. As a form of copy protection, coordinates in the VGA version of the game, while in the escape pod, as well as the rocket purchased at Tiny's used spaceships, are only found in the manual. Also, the code for retrieving the cartridge aboard the Arcada can only be found in the manual. The AGI version had key disk protection, where the user was required to insert the original game floppy on startup. Rebranded Space Quest 1, Roger Wilco in the Sarian Encounter to follow the series' new naming convention introduced in Space Quest 4, this version was released on August 20 of 1991. In addition to the new VGA graphics, which were drawn in 1950s retrofuturistic B-movie style, it now featured digitized sounds and a new interface, with text entry being replaced by an icon interface. Sales are believed to be around 200,000 to date, not including the many compilations it has been included in. Space Quest II: Vohol's Revenge is a graphic adventure game released on November of 1987 by Sierra Online. It was the sequel to Space Quest I: The Sarian Encounter, again using Sierra's AGI game engine. A comic is included in the manual to explain to the player what events have occurred since Space Quest I, when Roger Wilco became hero of Xenon. The player also learns of the villain Sludge Vohol, who was behind the original Sarian attack of the Arcada, and how he was driven mad. Despite his newfound status as hero, Roger is transferred to the Xenon Orbital Station 4 and promoted to head and only janitor. After some time, he is abducted by Sludge Vohol. As Roger is being transported to the Labion Labor mines as punishment for thwarting Sludge's original plan, the prison ship crash lands on a nearby jungle upon the planet. He manages to escape his pursuers and the dangers of the Labion jungle, and soon reaches Sludge's asteroid base, where he must stop Vohol's evil plan to eradicate sentient life from Xenon by launching millions of cloned insurance salesmen at the planet. Space Quest II, although still programmed in AGI, followed a more structured course of development than Space Quest I, as did almost all of the subsequent games. Now, all Sierra adventure games are produced following the same type of design document. The story script is written and then drawn out like a map or flowchart, indicating places, times, events, and actions. These storyboards, similar to those used by advertisers to visualize television commercials, are produced before the game is ever programmed, allowing Mark, Scott, and others involved in the game's development to visualize the whole thing before it's even transferred to the computer screen. The real advantage to following a design document is that so many bugs can be fixed early in the process at a minimal cost. The earliest versions of Space Quest were drawn on screen by Mark using Sierra's own graphics tools. Because disk space was so limited, backgrounds were saved as vector images which contained the instructions for drawing the pictures. When Sierra's art changed to 256 colors along with greater levels of detail, the method changed. Space Quest II was well received by both critics and consumers. As Consumer Gaming World noted, though the game is similar to the original Space Quest, The addition of more detailed animation, more difficult puzzles, an improved parser and greater scope makes a good game even better. Space Quest 2 was listed number 4 in Sierra's top 5 bestsellers. Therefore, it can be assumed that Space Quest 2 sold over 100,000 copies, thus earning the Software Publishers Association Gold Medal. Space Quest 3: The Pirates of Pestulon is a 1989 graphic adventure game by Sierra Online and the third game in the Space Quest series. Roger Wilco's escape pod from the end of Space Quest 2 is floating in space until it is picked up by an automated garbage freighter. Finding a derelict spaceship amongst the freighter's garbage, Roger sets out to repair the aluminum mallard and leave the SCO. Roger visits a variety of locations, including a fast food restaurant called Monolith Burger and a desert planet called Flibhat. At the latter, he encounters trouble as Arnoid the Annihilator, an Arnold Schwarzenegger-like android Terminator, persecutes him for not paying for a whistle acquired in Space Quest 2. From information he picks up there at the Monolith Burger, Roger eventually uncovers the sinister activities of a video game company known as Scamsoft, run by the Pirates of Pestulon. Both of those names sound a bit familiar, don't they? Pestulon, a small moon of the volcanic planet Ortega, is covered in soft moss-like vegetation and dotted with twisted tree-like growths throughout. Elmo Pug, the CEO of Scamsoft, has abducted the two guys from Andromeda and is forcing them to design awful games. Space Quest 3 was developed using an early version of Sierra's SCI engine. Unlike the series' previous installments, the player is no longer able to choose the protagonist's name. From this game onward, the character is known as Roger Wilco, the name that had previously been the default. The game features music composed by Supertramp drummer Bob Seidenberg and was one of the first games to support the new Sound Blaster sound card. Sound effects include digitized audio sampling, such as the voice of Roger saying "Where am I?" during the introduction. Though Space Quest 3 was designed to utilize those Sound Blaster's ability to play digital samples, the inclusion of an incorrect audio driver left the effects unavailable to IBM PC users. PC versions of the game support mouse movement and a new, heavily improved text parser. Mouse movement was still in a primitive state at the time of the game's release, so Roger is unable to automatically find his way around obstacles in the game world, instead stopping if he encounters a barrier. Computer mice were relatively new at the time, and Sierra's mouse movement would greatly improve in subsequent games. Space Quest 3 is the only game in the series to not have originated or have been remade officially or unofficially beyond the EGA graphics engine. Several attempts got cancelled. Space Quest 4: Roger Wilco and the Time Reapers is a 1991 graphic adventure game by Sierra Online. It was released on floppy disks on March of 1991 and later on re-released on CD-ROM in December of 1992 with full speech support and featuring laugh-in announcer Gary Owens as the voice of the narrator. It featured 256 color hand-painted graphics and a fully mouse-driven interface. It was one of the first games to use motion capture animation. In this installment, Roger embarks on a time travel adventure through Space Quest games both past and future. A reborn Sludge Vohol from the fictional Space Quest 12 Vohol's Revenge 2 chases Roger through time in an attempt to finally kill him. Roger also visits Space Quest X Latex Babes of Estros, whose title is a parody of Infocom's game Leather Goddesses of Phobos, and Space Quest I. In the latter, the graphics and music revert to the style of the original game, and Roger is threatened by a group of monochromatic bikers who consider Roger's 256 color pretentious. None of the gameplay takes place actually in Space Quest IV. In fact, the actual Space Quest IV is only seen briefly in the introduction. In contrast to the first three games, Space Quest IV uses a point-and-click interface featuring icons for different actions. The icons are an eye, a talking head, a walking person, a hand, a mouth and a nose, representing look, talk, walk to, use, taste and smell respectively. The last two almost never do anything other than provoke a humorous response from the game. Originally, the time pod codes could only be found in the manual as a form of copy protection. In later releases, the codes were added to the game. The game cost over $1 million to produce and sold more than its three predecessors combined. An Atari ST version was announced via Sierra Online's magazine Sierra News, but it was later cancelled. Space Quest V Roger Wilco The Next Mutation is a graphic adventure game released for MS-DOS on February of 1993. Space Quest V is unusual in the series in that it is primarily a specific parody of Star Trek. While there are some references to other fiction movies like Predator, Alien and The Fly, the game never moves too far away from its primary target. Roger's new ship features a command bridge and several officers to whom he can give orders, and eventually adopts a facehugger mascot called Spike, who leaves puddles of acid behind him wherever he goes. The game starts with a dramatic opening and Roger mid-mission on his ship. He is then revealed to be playing in a flight simulator shaped suspiciously like the Millennium Falcon at the Starcon Academy. Roger cheats to pass an aptitude test and he's given his own command, the Garbage Co. SCS Eureka, which looks and functions like an oversized vacuum cleaner. Eureka is also a brand of vacuum cleaners. The game involves several small missions similar to one seen in typical Star Trek episodes. Roger's son from the future saved him at the beginning of Space Quest IV, and later he shows a hologram of Roger's son's mother. Roger meets this woman in Space Quest V and must protect her, or else his son would not exist and thus neither would Roger. The main plot is to stop a mutagenic disease that is spreading through the galaxy by discovering its source and fighting everyone that got infected. In the end, the disease infects the crew members of the SCS Goliath, the Starcon flagship, whose 2P-wearing commander Rhymes T. Quirk, a rather blatant spoof of Captain James T. Kirk, subsequently attacks the Eureka. In the end, Roger sacrifices his ship to get rid of the plague and suddenly, if temporarily, becomes the commander of the fleet's flagship. Roger is presented in a more positive light than usual. He is still a loser and flies a ship that's falling apart at the seams, but along the adventure he gains the genuine respect of his crew members. The game was the first in the series not designed by the two guys from Andromeda, as only Mark Crow worked on the project. It was also the first Space Quest game that wasn't developed in-house by Sierra Online, but instead by Sierra's sister company Dynamics, to which Mark Crow had relocated shortly after the release of Space Quest IV. Space Quest V was also the only Space Quest game and the second Sierra title overall. Leisure Suit Larry 5 was the first to be sponsored by a real-life company. The logo for Sprint would appear following any communications transmissions, appear on a billboard in the spacebar, and also appear in the ending credits. Additionally, at one point in the game, there is a dialogue between two people where one denounces MCI's Friends and Aliens plan as just not worth it. Space Quest V was one of several Sierra's games given away as a reward for signing up for service with Sprint. Although the game came after the CD-ROM Tolkien version of Space Quest IV, it was originally released on floppy disks only, although it would later be released on a compilation CD containing the entire Space Quest series, and early plans for a Tolkien version of the game were scrapped. Space Quest VI Roger Wilco in the Spinal Frontier is a point-and-click adventure game developed and published by Sierra Online in 1995. It is the sixth and final game in the Space Quest series. The game begins with Roger Wilco being court-martialed for various humorous reasons, all of which Roger, being the idiot that he is, cannot defend properly. He is demoted back to his position as second-class janitor aboard the SES Deep Ship 86, a parody of Deep Space Nine. Among the reasons for Roger being simply demoted and not expelled from Starcom is the safe return of the SES Eureka. This is a continuity error in that the Eureka was in fact destroyed in Space Quest V. Later, on the Deep Ship, Commander Kielbasa, named after the Kielbasa sausage and a parody of the Kilrathi from the Wing Commander series of video games, announces that as a reward for their excellence in A Glitch in Time Saves Gamma 9, a parody of A Stitch in Time Saves 9, they are to be given shore leave for the planet Polisorbate LX, LX pronounced 60 after the preservative. Meanwhile, an extremely old and wrinkled woman named Sharpay, after the dog breed of the same name, also noted for its wrinkles, and voiced by Lucille Bliss, is revealed to be plotting Roger's demise. It is later revealed that she is the subject of Project Immortality, which was supposed to prolong life indefinitely. Space Quest VI Roger Wilco in the Spinal Frontier ran on the later SCI-32 engine. This allowed it to use Super VGA graphics with 256 colors at 640 by 480 resolution. Unlike other SCI games, it did not have the interface in a pull-down bar at the top of the screen, but instead used a verb bar window along the bottom of the screen, similar to LucasArts' CAM engine. The graphic style was also more cartoonish than in previous games, as well as incorporating an ample amount of 3D rendered images. Gary Owens served again as the narrator. Josh Mantel designed the majority of Space Quest VI, with Scott Murphy on board in a creative consultant capacity, but had to leave the project shortly before completion due to internal strife with Sierra. Sierra asked Scott Murphy to complete the game and then, reportedly against Murphy's wishes, promoted Space Quest VI as if the former guy from Andromeda was solely responsible for it. As an additional result of this change in designers, some puzzles, primarily in the later stages of the game, were poorly implemented due to lack of communication. In a 2006 interview, Mandel spoke candidly about his disappointment with the uneven puzzle design and implementation in the game. One of the inventory items cut was a comic book CD in Nigel's room that was fully readable and had all the hints to the data coder puzzle. From a writing and design standpoint, it was fully finished, and I know that Barry Smith had started the artwork. I don't understand why it was cut, but the comic book content was something I'd worked on for months and was something that I was uncharacteristically proud of. I think it would have been one of the greatest parody sequences in the Space Quest series. So, not only was I very upset not to see it in the game, but the fact that they had to put the data coder hints in the manual, leading players to think it was meant to be copy protection, disturbed me greatly. Space Quest 6 Roger Wilco in the Spinal Frontier was well received by critics who praised its good voice work, very nice animation and humor. Sierra tried on several occasions to revive the series for another episode with a working title of the Return to Roman numerals, since the previous game was titled Space Quest 6 and not Space Quest VI. Development of Space Quest 7 was underway in 1996 when Sierra released the Space Quest Collection, which consisted of Space Quest 1 through 6 and included a brief trailer of Space Quest 7 consisting of Roger strapping a giant rocket to his back and using it to push himself forward on roller skates in a scene reminiscent of Wile E. Coyote. Little was released regarding storyline, interface, etc., although there was speculation that the game would introduce a multiplayer aspect. Scott Murphy said during development that Space Quest 7 would contain some 3D elements but would not require the use of a 3D accelerator card. Due to poor sales of Grim Fandango, a high-profile adventure game by LucasArts, there was a perception that humorous adventure games were no longer viable, so when Vivendi took over Sierra, Space Quest 7 was cancelled. The project was eventually restarted in 1999 and pitched to management, but ultimately did not have enough support to continue within the company. On April of 2012, Mark Crow and Scott Murphy announced that they had reunited and were planning an original adventure game set in space. They established a new game development company called Two Guys from Andromeda for that purpose. Co-founder of the company, Chris Pope, dubbed as Space Pope from fans, works to operate its marketing and interact directly with fans as well as executive producer. A Kickstarter project was launched to fund the development of the new game or space venture, with plans to feature the voice of Gary Owens, the narrator of Space Quest 4 and 6, prior to his death in 2015. On June of 2012, they achieved their goal of $500,000 from their Kickstarter campaign and began working on the game. The game acts as a spiritual successor to the Space Quest series, including the use of a blue-collar worker, now a repairman rather than a janitor, as its protagonist. The hero in this case is named Ace Hardway, after the home improvement chain Ace Hardware. Another character is Clark Yeager, after test pilot Chuck Yeager. He is a chicken superhero based on the Astro Chicken running gag in the Space Quest series. The game will be rendered in CGI, but a retro graphics feature has been proposed. On July of 2020, a complete beta was released to Kickstarter backers. Currently, the game is yet to be released, with no update on a possible date since November of 2021. Hopefully, the Two Guys from Andromeda will be able to complete the game and release it to the eager audience that awaits. Let us all hope that this chapter is the actual beginning for a new era of Roger Wilco Space Quest-like adventures. That was the complete history of another iconic Sierra franchise, the Space Quest series, an IP that found its first steps in the early days of the genre and hopefully will continue its existence, though substantially changed in the current generation. Do not forget to watch the other videos in this series along with a 2-hour documentary on the rise and fall of the adventure games. If you like my content, please do not forget to support the channel by subscribing and pressing the like button. Thank you all for watching.